Everybody, welcome to this broadcast. This one is very specific. It's really talking about the concept of worship and the idea of worship, and to understand the concept of the ultimate worship, that we're all worshipers, all people are worshipers. But we got to figure out what we worship or worship, or what we give our awe and our reverence to. And that really is going to be played out by the Holy Spirit. When God is showing us our hearts, He is showing us what we fear, what makes us awe, what makes us tremble. And then we make our decisions based upon that. And so our priorities, in other words, how we order ourselves, shows our worship. So whom we fear, whom we have awe for, and that shows us who is our God. Even the idea of God, if you want to get into the Hebrew, El or Elohim, or the El concept, Elohim, this idea of who's the mighty one, a Baal, would be a husband or a lord, or one who basically rules over you, or a Molech or Malek, which is a king. Who's ruling over you? Who has charge over you? Whose message are you listening to? Even the idea of Malachi or Molech is the idea it's a messenger, or one who has authority and is speaking with great authority, and you are following the rules of that, quote, power, that Lord. Hey, Kimberly, good to see you. So the key is not whether or not you worship, is to what God you do worship. All human beings fear and tremble, and then they respond, or they order their lives in a certain way for a certain amount of appeasement. There is an appeasement that people have for what has their greatest priority, what causes their awe, such as when you have the 12 go into the Canaan land, spy. It's interesting because the scripture, God calls himself this mighty God, and that the inhabitants are grasshoppers. But they came back saying that before these people, they are gods, and we are grasshoppers in their eyes. And so you can start transferring the label or the honor or the position of a god to your situation, to your fear, to your circumstances, to whatever causes you to tremble and to awe, whatever your mind is narrating over. However big the situation that is being presented before you, and what you do with it is going to be where your worship, your awe, your dread, your ordering of your life goes. And so your God will be revealed. And so this is a very key thing, that we put our fears in check. We look at what makes us dread, what makes us tremble. To think that, okay, these other things are going to make me fear, dread, and tremble, and I'm going to appease those things, but then I'm a secret believer of God, is absolutely a non-truth. God knows who are his. God knows in whom there is a great fear and sense of the awe of who God is, and that your life is ordered and everything is in proportion to how big and amazing and powerful and awesome your Lord is. So we can't hide who our lords are. It will be revealed. We can lie to ourselves. We could create a narrative that says, oh, well, I believe in God, but then your whole life speaks to you bowing and scraping and appeasing, quote, another God, false God. And we're looking at the concept of new gods, something where other people can suck you into it. You're looking around, you're seeing kind of how they order their life and what they really fear, and we're checking in with each other, and there's all this kind of social cues, and we go, well, they're doing it, we can do it. In other words, it's the opposite of the three worthies that are dealing with the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar, or the idol that was set up at Babylon. And they say, we don't fear this. We stand before God. You could destroy our body. We don't have to go and think about this. We fear the living God and whatever he decides to do in this situation. So God is always trying to say that Satan is very insidious. He knows how to generate the kind of fear and anxiety and the dread and the phobias, and those become your gods. You want to deal with your mental health issues around fear and anxiety and phobias? Well, what's being magnified in your mind? What are you focusing upon? What is being enlarged? And what is turning into this giant being? And how is your narrative around this stuff? How are you dialoguing with these things? How large does something become? You can have such a clear view of who the eternal living God is that there is no situation in this planet or amongst the cosmos that would cause you to fear and to tremble, because your fear and trembling is before him in whom all life is being held in his hands. All of creation will have to stand before him on that day. The reality that the elements will melt with fervent heat, the mountains, the hills, the people, the wicked, even the righteous tremble and their faces go blanch. And it says that all those that will stand before the Lord will disappear outside of those who have a living covenant and are hid in the offering that he has provided in his son. There's a certain amount of rearranging in your mind. There's a certain amount of being his child, being his son, being his daughter, being his offspring. The reality that though a 2,000-foot ocean tidal wave is towering over you, you say, well, I fear not even this, because my God is also the God over the grave, and death gives me no fear and trembling. I don't worship death. I don't worship my circumstances. I don't worship those things. I worship the living God, the eternal God, this type of thing. So what we're going to see here is the concept of new gods or false gods, and this idea of what causes us to fear, and the condemnation that we're going to look at, book of Revelation, chapter 21, of the condemnation of cowardice, what that even looks like. A lot of people read that and they don't understand what that great condemnation is. Like, really? How do you put your thinking in that way? Well, I'm glad you're at the study, because that's exactly what we're going to look at. How do you really switch your thinking? How do you start to put these things in their right dimension, in the right proportion, and how is God magnified? All through the scripture does talk about, Kimberly, how God is magnified through our meditation about him, through our worship of him, through our opening our heart to him. As he becomes more magnified and we start to see him, we start to understand his ways, we understand how he's mighty in the large things and the little things and the medium things, and how we put our well-being into his hands and how trustworthy he is. And we start to really see who he is. We start to run the promises through our minds. We're around people where God becomes a big deal, and is a big deal, and that's nurtured and that is cultivated. And the more that we rely on God and trust on God and focus on God and go through his word and really be in communion with him, and he becomes this huge part of our mind, our life, our reality, our, what's before us. And that's the whole idea of what we're going to get into. Worship is what you put before you and what you do when that thing is before you. If it's an idol, do you bow down before it, or do you destroy it, right? Do you take the sword of the word of God to it and say, this is a non-God, I don't bow to this, okay? It's a dead thing to me, or I'm dead to that, this type of thing. It's all mental narrative. This is the big part. And to think that we're going to fool God because we fooled ourselves doesn't work. What am I trying to say about this? A lot of people like to say that they're true believers, and yet they're constantly cowering under their circumstances because they don't want to lose the seeming benefits of the situation. It's the whole worship of God or mammon. And either you want to be bound to the benefits of this world, or you're willing to serve God, whatever the consequences are. And then your mettle is kind of tested. In other words, it's good that you suffer for Christ. It's good that you receive the persecution, because God has to show you that bigger picture, that the things that you feared the most are something to be minimized in your mind. Because it's usually the anticipation of something is what magnifies it in our mind. And then when you go through it, you go, well, you know what? That wasn't as bad as I thought. I'm glad I trusted God. God delivered me from that situation, or through the situation, and I realized how large of a picture God was working out. Even when Paul was in prison, he says, hey, Caesar's household greets you, and even Paul's chains were for the liberty of other people. And he's like, hey, listen, now I don't even fear death, in that way. All right, so let's go to our text. Let's start looking at what we're looking at here. Let's check this thing out. So in Judges, right when they got into the promised land and they fell into all kinds of nonsense, right away, chapter 5, they chose new gods. We'll get into this. Then there was what? Because of that, there was war in the gates. If you want an unsettled mind, if you want to lose your peace with Christ, start worshiping your gods of fear. The things that you fear, start worshiping your anxieties and let them be gods, and you will what? Have war in the gates of your soul. Make no mistake about it. There was a shield or spear. Was there a shield or spear seen among 40,000 in Israel? And so what's the real answer to that is that your weapons of warfare, because these are spiritual, right? The weapons of your warfare are not carnal, they're spiritual. These are casting down strongholds of your mind, imaginations, thoughts, narratives in your head, the dialogue that you're dealing with. And Satan is constantly playing to that. And we're going to get into some pretty major psychological stuff in this study, because you have to, because you might be in a very, quote, religious setting, in a very spiritualized setting, but unfortunately, maybe even your spouse, or maybe even your brothers and sisters that are around you, or the people that you surround yourself with, even in your fellowship, are dialoguing and narrating things that appeal to your fears. Abandonment issues, issues of, well, we're not going to like you anymore, or your opportunities aren't going to be there. We're not going to validate you. You're going to lose your significance in our eyes. And you're like, oh, what? And you're going to see that's what happened. That was where Satan really took over first century Israel. That became the very environment, the climate, the milieu that killed Christ. It was a Christ-killing climate to have this other gods ruling you. And you could see that even in the spiritual community, where there was no question as to their zealousness for God, right? And yet they became the God crucifiers. They became deiciders. Well, you're going to see the climate of fear that was there amongst the ruling class, amongst the Pharisees, amongst the priests, amongst the scribes, amongst the scholars, amongst the pastors, amongst the clergy. You're going to see that they created a huge fear of them and their entire institutionalized political system. And you were fearful of losing your career or whatever this thing is, and it caused you to transfer gods. And you will see that both John the Baptist and Christ says you are a what? A generation of vipers. Your father is the devil, and you're causing other people to subscribe to your fear and trembling, and you are not receiving the living God himself. God came to his own, and his own did what? Received him not. And yet, nobody questioned the spirituality of these people. And we are reduplicating, or have already reduplicated, that very environment. That's why I believe we're so close to the coming of Christ, because we've reduplicated. We have recapitulated. In other words, we have redone the entire system of the first century. We're here now. We're perfectly set up like the first century. So all those dynamics that were in the first century are today. And you're going to see that politically, spiritually, sociologically, psychologically, ideologically, the whole schmear is exactly set up as the first advent of Christ. And here we are really on the cusp of the second advent of Christ. And it's no new rules, because we said that they chose new gods. But let's look at what Ecclesiastes says about this whole thing, about new. Is it new? When Ecclesiastes says history merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. These aren't really, quote, new gods, but they are a switch of a different God. Sometimes people say, here is something new, but actually it is old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, right? See, we should be learning these things. And in the future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now. So that's what we're doing. We're going back and relearning. These things were written for our admonition, unto whom the ends of the world have come. And we have recorded in biblical history the first century dynamics and the problem with Israel taking upon false gods. And the climate that the prophets had to deal with was this concept of fear. God had to basically nurture up, strengthen up, prop up his prophets and say, don't fear their faces. Don't be afraid. And whose faces? The heathen? No. Don't fear the faces of the priests, the ruling class, the scribes, those that are in those religious positions who hold your well-being and your career and everything else. So when there's an apostasy amongst God's people, it's infused with this climate of fearing them, and yet they have all the supposed religious, political, spiritual, psychological authority in people's lives, that the tendency, the propensity is to fear these people. And you're catching up on the subtext that is there. There is a subtext of saying, accept this or you won't be accepted. Play along with this and to subscribe to the order of things here. And if you don't, we will punish you. And at that point, you are switching your fear, your awe, your trembling, your dread to that God, whatever God that is. And the prophets had to go in and deal with that. And deal with the fact that there is a grand apostasy. They're weeping for Tammuz. They've turned their backs against God. They're worshiping the sun. The whole man-pleaser thing that tried to come into the first century, the whole partiality and people-pleasing, and this whole idea of setting one person above another and the respecter of persons thing. Immediately, Satan came in and reflooded the system that was brand new Christianity, and Paul rebuked Peter for doing that when James came in Antioch, down to James talking about it afterwards and saying, don't set one person above the other. And this sense of awe and trembling for these people is false worship. You are worshiping man. You are worshiping the image of God, not the reality of God. Another man is at best, the image of God, and you're to never worship them. That's why all the disciples, all the apostles, prophets never accepted worship, because we are an image. And the problem is that too many people want to be worshiped. They play all the political games and they climb up that, and they know how to lay all their little fear me traps through their nuances and their little Dick Cheney sneering kind of a thing. And you're all queued up to play the little game. And you don't realize that you've switched gods. You have a new God at that point. And you aren't getting away with it by saying, well, for our well-being, for our sake, for our, it's advantageous right now to worship this, to obey this, but we're still good with the living God. God says, no, you're not. I see through that. You've switched gods and you're going to be destitute on that day, right? Just to protect ourselves in fear. You've got it, sister. You've got it. And that's the problem. This self kind of interest that is constantly gnawing at us, that is being appealed to by Satan himself and our own insecurities. That's how we lay a hold of this type of false worship. That's how Satan exploits us and gets his strongholds and his foothold in our life. And we are now fearing and trembling and submitting to another God. Okay, let's go back to our texts. Thanks for showing up for this studies. It's great to have someone here live, even though people watch it afterwards. Let's look at Deuteronomy 32. This is still this whole Song of Moses thing going on. He's writing the blessings and the curses, and he says, they have what? Corrupted themselves. Okay, this is the context. Their spot is not the spot of his children. They are what? A perverse and crooked generation. John the Baptist in Christ calls out this perverse generation because it happened amongst God's people. It happened at the bottom of Mount Sinai with the golden calf. It's happened throughout the history of God's people. God's people have submitted to other gods over and over and over again. If the Bible is obsessed with anything, it's obsessed with dealing with this. And yet we avoid it, dealing with it like the plague, like it's some bad thing to deal with this. Do ye thus requite the Lord, O foolish people and unwise? Yeah, watch this. Is not thy father that hath brought thee? Like, is not God your father? Like, aren't you supposed to be under his discipline? Aren't you supposed to fear him? Hath he not made you, made thee? That's whom you reverence and fear, right? And established you. But what does God's people tend to do? But Jeshurun wax fat. Now, what's Jeshurun even mean? It means the upright or the righteous ones, just like the Pharisees. They wax fat, and in their prosperity, and they kicked. In other words, they became rebellious. And thou art waxen fat, and thou art grown thick-hearted, thick at hearing, thick at seeing, blind, deaf, just like in the first century, just like now. Thou art covered with fatness. Prosperity, presumption, it's literally like being covered in fat. Okay, that's the picture here. And it says, then he forsook God, which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. Did he esteem it? Yes, but it was esteemed lightly. Then what did they do? Provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. That's why the prophets are the voice of that, and God is a jealous God, and that's why God speaks the way he does through his servants, the prophets. With abominations that they provoked him to anger. So did the prophets speak with the jealousy and anger of the Lord? Yes. And they sacrifice unto who? Devils. It's not neutral ground to do this. Not to God. To gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came up newly, whom your fathers did not fear and tremble and dread. You see, what did Christ say? He says, listen, if you say Abraham's your father, you'd be doing the things Abraham did. He worshiped me, Christ says. He feared and trembled before me. He made offering before me. He called me and realized that I am. I'm Yahweh. When I visited him and I told him about Isaac representing me as the seed that will come and be the true inheritor, Abraham realized who was standing before him. So what's this son of Abraham thing? What is this calling yourself one of my children when in fact you have switched gods? New gods. You fear the gods they didn't fear. And you don't fear the God they feared. We better, what do they say? Check yourself or you will wreck yourself. Yeah, people do substitute what they worship. You're right. So let's go back. It says, of the rock that begat thee, thou art unmindful. That's how we magnify God, is to keep him ever magnified in our mind. You have forgotten. That's why we ever keep God before us, of who formed you, who created you, who redeemed you, who created all things. This is God. Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of judgment has come. Worship him who made everything, including you and this entire universe. If you want to fear something, fear him in whom all of his creation will have to deal with. And when the Lord, Yahweh, the one who is reality and life, saw it, he what? Abhorred them. You think this is something that you can somehow is acceptable before God? That God will bear our excuses? He abhors this stuff because of what? The provoking of his sons. This provokes him and provokes others to do this. This cues the people around you because of the provoking of his sons and his daughters. This is contagious. And he says, I will do what? Even though they seek his face, they say, I'll hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are what? A very froward generation, children in whom is no, are you ready for this? Faith. I'll finish up this verse because I really want to touch on this. Froward generation, no faith. False proclamation, declaration of faith, but not true faith, not true trust. They moved me to jealousy. In other words, the heat and color came up into his face and made his nostrils flare. It's the word off, in which is not God. Not God. You can't have it both ways, saints. They have provoked me to anger with their what? Vanities. Empty. I will move them to jealousy with those that are not a people. Remember, Paul quotes this in Romans, because the Jews, what? Lost their salvation. They destroyed themselves. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish generation. Remember Paul, Romans chapters 9 through 11, and says, listen, this is the problem. The generation of vipers. This wicked generation who switched gods and crucified the Lord of glory. What is he going to require of them? You're going to see. Repentance. He says, listen, you can't avoid this. You can't say, well, okay, God, you should understand my circumstances right now. He says, no, acknowledge it. You'll see it here when we get into Deuteronomy 28. Acknowledge it. Confess that you were a coward. Confess that you feared another God. Confess it, because you're going to have to identify it. You can't just dismiss this. If you confess, it'll say in, I think it's going to be in Leviticus chapter 26, I will forgive you. I will heal you. But just this whole, well, it's on the down low. I am a cryptic Christian. I'm the secret agent for Jesus Christ. I'm going to do both worlds. He says, you will lose your salvation. You will be judged. You will miss out. You will be forsaken. You will presume upon God, but he'll say, depart from me. I never knew you. You weren't really mine. You feared something else. You're a child without faith. You're saved by faith in the living God. It's faithless to be a coward, to be fearful, to tremble and worship the dictates and the demands of another God that you fear and tremble under. And then you're going to give some token little thing on the living God on the side because, you want to make sure that you have your insurance policy over here. God says, I see exactly who your God is. I was second best to you. I got your sloppy seconds. I don't want him. I don't want him. He's worthy of our supreme. He is most supreme. He is worthy of our most preeminent worship. And we're always tested as to whom our God is. And a lot of times it's what's convenient, what is expeditious, what helps out our little situation. God, you'll understand. God's a merciful God. And you'll see here as we get into doctrines of like false gods. It's very interesting because there is the God of cowardice. And you're going to be surprised, even in Greek mythology, the God of cowardice is going to surprise you. We're going to be looking at, there is a mythical God of cowardice, and you're going to be shocked, saying, no, I thought that was the God of courage itself. And you're going to see that Homer brings out that, no, this God was the God of cowardice because it looked this way. This was how it appeared, but it was something else. You guys ready for that? It's going to be very interesting. That's right, the prince of this world, who will tell you that the well-being of your life or people accepting you, or you being validated, you being made significant, you finding your significance in these things or whatever else, in this whole, you're not going to be affirmed, you're not going to be validated, and then you go, oh, well, I'm still holding on to that. You haven't cast your idols away. You haven't destroyed the high places. You still have, as you'll see as we get into it, you still have that in the meditation of your heart. And Satan exploits that, and that's how he conquers you, right? Is this self-interest game that we play. Secret self-interest game. These little things we cherish. Let's look at Homer's Eris, where you get the Aries, the zodiac sign. In fact, what I was going to do is put the... let's see if I can still do it. Yeah, I'll just kind of do this. Can you see it? So it's the goat head. It's the goat head, right? Goat head soup. There's your goat head for you. Aries, right? Who is the god of war, right? We get Mars and Aries from. But check this out. Was bloody and merciless while the god of war, right? But was a coward who cried in pain when wounded. Victim god. Ego wounded. was a coward who cried in pain when wounded. Man, take that in. And runs away, a fight or flight mode. Was a coward God who cried in pain when wounded and runs away. On the battlefield, he was accompanied by Phobos, where you get phobia, fear, and Deimos, terror, where you get deity from, right? As a god. His name meant to dread, as you're going to see here when we get into the Greek of the New Testament. And his daughters, strife and horror, enyo. And what's interesting, other daughters are harmony and love, eros, a sensual love, that he had children with Aphrodite. Now, what does this even mean? Because a lot of people that won't confront their fears say, well, we did it for harmony and for human love. We wanted harmony. So all of a sudden they jump onto when God is getting you to deal with this false god. There is this big bloated kind of warrior kind of thing, tough guy, tough person kind of a thing. But when wounded, there is this crying in pain and running away. And who are the companions in that warfare? Phobias, fears, terror, deimos, dread, and strife, horror, harmony, and eros, love. Wow. And so what happens is, no. You're against, to conform, to get along, go along to get along. But we have to be harmonious. Now it's time for harmony, I guess. Now is the time for, they're going to be preaching love because that's their covering. That's waxing fat of Jeshurun. They're covering themselves in the fat of the justification, but they're really motivated by phobias and fears and terror and dread. And so the children that go to fight for them is their justification is harmony and love, but it's a sensual love. It's eros. Is that fascinating? And that's exactly the game that is constantly being played. It's this backing down when it looks like you're going to have to deal with some of the demons of the situation. You're having to deal with the faces that you're supposed to not be fearing. And instead, what they do is they run away. And there is the phobia, the fear, the dread, the terror, right? The horror. And then they said, well, the reason we back down, you're going to see as we get into Saul dealing with Goliath is, well, we want harmony and, we have to love one another. Ouch. But it's the goat head God. It's the goat head God. The goat head God. All right, let's look at the battle with Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, we skipped around a little bit. It's too big of a chapter, so I just caught some points I thought was interesting. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies together, what? To battle, right? Ares. They're going to go and battle. They're getting themselves all set up. Whoops. They gathered their armies together to battle, right? The Philistines. And were gathered at Socha, which belongs to Judah, and they camped there between Socha and Ezekiah. And Saul and the men of Israel gathered together. And they camped in the valley of Elah, right? And they what? Drew up in battle array against the Philistines. So they, just like Ares, the goat god, are ready for war. Whoops, why is this doing this? They drew up in battle against the Philistines. And a champion went out from the camp. So all of a sudden someone distinguishes himself and they become afraid. Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 and 6, right? He had a bronze helmet, which is a picture of judgment. They're afraid of being judged. And he was armed with a coat of mail. He seemed untouchable. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had a lot of weight to bring to bear upon you in judgment. He had a bronze armor on his legs that he could walk with judgment and authority, and he could ruin your life or your career, and a bronze javelin between the shoulders. He seems to have the weight of things that produce judgment. Bronze is judgment, a kind of a outside glory, of judgment. Then he stood and cried out to the enemies of Israel, right? To the enemies of Israel, and said to them, why have you come out to the line for battle? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Why have you come out to the lines of battle? It's the whole, okay, this is so important. This whole idea of building yourself up and talking yourself up, and then you go to face your enemy, and then you obey the fear, the phobia, remember Aries? The terror, the dread. Every time you get yourself all worked up and then you go to battle and you back down, you are constantly reinforcing the phobia, the fear. It is to show your worship to that God. They were worshiping Goliath. They're worshiping his judgment. They were worshiping that fear and that dread inspired their worship. So they're building up to go against him, and that confidence that they were getting. And then every time that it was realized who was there and they backed out, was reinforcing that phobia. Like in counseling, those that have problems with phobias, those that have problem with panic disorders and anxiety, the more you obey it, the more it grows. The more you concede to it, the greater it becomes. That's how these false gods are formed. And you get off with your friends, or you start getting into your whole, oh, I'll be great the next time around. I'll be really, courageous, and I will really deal with it. And then it comes around, and then you back off, say, no, but the next time. Oh, no, actually the next time. Well, the time after that. Each time you concede to those fears, it takes a greater grip. It takes more territory of your soul. It grabs more of you. It indwells greater kind of land inside of your mind and your heart and your being and everything else. And they were ruining themselves by doing this. They needed a champ. They needed to see what somebody who can face this down and have victory. And you're going to see as the story of David shows up is a picture of like, why have you made him bigger than he is? Why has he grown in your mind? Why are you calling yourself grasshoppers on their side? Why have you turned them into a god? Why have you turned your fear and your dread and your obedience? Why have you allowed this to become a deity to you? And it's even kind of startling to the demons. They say, am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul? Remember, I thought Saul was a man of war. He was a great warrior. Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me if he is able to fight with me and kill me. And then we will be your servants. Because guess what's happening? This is about servanthood right here. To whom you serve is to whom you obey. You obey to whom you serve. You serve to whom you obey. That is your God. And if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall what? Be our servants and serve us. This is worship 101. This is the anatomy of worship. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And you got to figure out whether you are standing alone in Christ, facing this judgment, this fear that you have. No more just building it up. No more talking yourself up in this big inflated view. Because the more you back down, the greater the God becomes. Then Saul and all of Israel heard these words with the Philistine, and they were what? Dismayed and greatly afraid. Get into the Hebrew study there, and you'll see they worshiped. They bowed, they trembled, they knocked their knees, they worshiped. And David occasionally went and returned from Saul to what? To feed the father's sheep at Bethlehem. For some reason, a person who is feeding them the word, feeding them is the one, anyone who feeds on the word and feeding others are going to be prepared for this battle. Then Jesse said for his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain, 10 loaves, run to your brothers at the camp. Carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands and see how your brothers fare. Bring back news of them. Those that are genuinely feeding will be able to stand. For Israel, the Philistines had what? What did they do? They drew up in battle array, army against army, and then they would cower out again and again and again, and they were committing worship after worship after worship. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, came and greeted his brothers. Then he asked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, by them, and by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to what? The same words. That's what Satan does. He just has the same words hitting you over and over again, the same narrative, the same tapes playing in your head, the same dialogue that you bow down to over and over and over again, appealing to that ingrained narrative. So, but David heard them, and the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him. When they saw him, they fled from him and were what? Dreadfully afraid. The word for worship, you guys, right here. They, when they saw, worshiped him. Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he says, why did you come up here? In other words, the right narrative is, why are we fearing this? We have a greater God that we're in covenant with. This God, this El, this mighty one, is not in covenant relation with God. This is a mortal being. Right narrative. Not looking at what everyone else is doing. Not the big talk up, not the big build up. David wasn't there on the 50th try of like, okay, guys, you guys ready to work yourself up again? Okay, guys, ready? And on the count of 3, and then they go, and then they back down. And then every time you do that, you're just making it worse and worse and worse and worse. And you're becoming less and less able to defeat the next time around. You become worse. That's a hard habit to break. Cowardice is the hardest habit in the world to break. You cannot start down that road and think later on when it's more convenient. Oh, well, we'll believe what you say, Paul, in a more convenient time when it doesn't take so much courage to make this stand for Christ. There is, that's the worst plan in the world because you're switching gods to a new God. Now, his oldest brother, he'd heard David, what was David saying? What is going on? Why are you guys talking this way? So Eliab's anger was aroused against David when he says, why did you come up here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Hey, don't you know your place, David? Who are you? Don't you know your place? And then you have the narrative of those who are close to you saying that we're going to undermine the narrative that you have. You need to be doing something else. You don't belong here. You need us experts here to do this, even though they are cowering, even though they are being defeated endlessly. And then they want to attribute it to what? David's pride and his what? Insolent heart, which is actually interesting, the whole transference of what was going on here, the projection, the narcissism, the self-interest of these people, his, quote, brothers. For you have come down to see the battle. You're just here for your own purposes, David. And David says, really? What have I done is wrong? There's not a real reason. There's not a cause for me to do what I'm doing right now. Are you serious? We're not even thinking or talking like God's children right now. There was nothing wrong with David being astonished as to the fearfulness and the narrative that they have normalized. Then he turned from him toward another and said, and that's what he should do. Okay, I can't reason with you. Let me talk to somebody else. And he said what? The same thing. These people answered him as the first ones did. And you're going to get all this conformity. That's what I'm going to touch on real quick. Because amongst the fear-driven, you're going to have other people joining in that confederacy, that peer group. There is a peer pressure. There is other people that, and David's turning saying, can I get something else from somebody else? And the answer is no. No, they've all bought into it. It's all a collective kind of fear-mongering that went on. They've all bought into the narrative that's there. And what you're going to have to find out is that you cannot borrow from someone else's courage, because guess what? You might not be around people that genuinely are worshiping the living God. And there is a social cue, and there is the nuancing saying, we're worshiping this other God right now. God will have to understand. And David's not having any of this. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So Saul clothed David with his armor, which is interesting. I've kind of moved into the story because, okay, you want to go for it? And that's the problem. This is not the armor. This is the losing armor. The armor we wear, the protective measures that we take, all of the defense mechanisms that Saul had, obviously this is the story. It's not going to work for David. The narrative, the armor, what we use to protect ourselves is to be rejected. This will ruin you. This is not the answer. You don't go along. You don't conform. There was a whole climate of cowardice and conformity that was going on there. And David's going to have to go into this thing naked. And in other words, even Saul, as you're going to see here, try to put a bronze helmet on David's head and say, oh yeah, I'm going to give you kind of I'm going to coach you in my narrative of judging Saul and stuff of judging Goliath and all this other kind of stuff. And like, I don't want your brain in my brain. I don't want to be the worshiper of an uncircumcised, of someone that is not truly the living God. David was a man after God's own heart. He loved God. And if you love God, you would obviously see the terror and the conformity and the cowardice as unacceptable. And there's no way you're going to conform to this and you're not wearing that armor. Or you will be defeated. You'll be destroyed. You would be serving that God. Narrative is everything. They put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. All the defense mechanisms that Saul was using doesn't work. And so David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, but what? He had not tested them. In other words, they don't fit him. It's not his armor. So David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these. I have not tested them. David took them off. We cannot use these false mechanisms, these things that look like they're working for people. They're not going to work for you. They're not going to work in that battle. You're dealing with a God demanding worship, and it's a false God. It's a God that's going to have to face the God of these gods. Okay? A new God is trying to get your allegiance and get you to switch your allegiance over to this God of fear, this God of being afraid of all, appealing to all of this kind of fleshy stuff, to all this kind of confident narrative, like the God of Aries. And then the second you get wounded, you run away and you see yourself as the victim. The big runaway, build up, run away, build up, run away, build up, run away, build up, run away. Ruining your spiritual battle. Face those fears, face those false gods, face those beings, those circumstances, those situations, realizing that you are obeying God, the living God, the eternal God, right? So what's the answer? What's the key? Well, we think this big giant buildup like the false god of fear, Aries. No, be shattered, you people, and be broken in pieces. Give ear, all you from far countries. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, be broken in pieces. Okay, I got to touch on this real quick. We need to be broken before the living God. We are girded with the loins of our minds, right? Is that what the scripture talks about? To not fear these other gods, to not fear the judgment of Satan, to not fear other men, to not give preference of these people, to not fall into the social cues and patterning ourselves after what everyone else is doing to go along, to get along ism. That's the climate that is going to ruin God's people in these last days. But everyone is cueing that we should do that because these people have the brick and the mortar, just like the disciples said to Jesus. Well, isn't that great, Jesus? Are you just yelling at those people, in Matthew chapter 23? So it's Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. Okay, well, you kind of got them mad and you called them names and stuff like that. But isn't it great we're going to inherit all the buildings and stuff? And Christ says there's not going to be a building left upon another. Like, really? Like, do you really think that they're going to just yield up the Institute? The Institute will be taken down. This self-preservation mode that you guys are so worried about how I talk to the Pharisees, what are you worried about? This whole thing has got to come down. You aren't understanding that no matter what their coalition is, no matter how much they sit in the board meetings, no matter how much they agree on things together, it comes to nothing. You're not to hallow them. You're not to fear them. You're not to worship them. Fear and worship the eternal God, right? Amen. Somebody needs to study. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Get all your friends together. Get a bunch of people to agree on this false reality. Speak the word, but it won't stand. For God is with us. This is the word, the idea of Emmanuel. God will stand with us. Forget about looking at what other people are going to do or make happen or establish. It just won't be a reality before God. Do not say a conspiracy concerning all that these people call a conspiracy or confederacy. In other words, they're all agreeing together. They look very powerful. They all seem to be united. Nor be afraid of their what? Threats. Nor be troubled. That is the false worship right there. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. You want to be people of the sanctuary? We'll get into this real quick. You want to be people that are people of faith in these last days? Well, abide with Christ in the heavenly temple, that your position is in him up in heaven, and the world is but what? Vanity, vapor. Not one stone left upon another. Nothing standing before God. This fear of man, this desire to be validated through what's established and by the people and the council and the validating committees and the affirmation kind of scene that's there and the sense of significance that comes from the establishment and all this other kind of stuff, that is a false fear. That's their threats, how they could trouble your life. They are getting you to transfer your worship. They're transferring your fear, your dread over to them, and your well-being is now placed upon shifting sands of human endeavors, human functions, and human structure. Go back to our text. But he will be as a sanctuary, a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. Wasn't this a great comfort? The disciples, when the entire structure was shaken and all that can be shaken was shaken, not one stone left upon another, to both the houses of Israel as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Those that are caught up in the system, it will be a snare to them. And many among them shall stumble and shall fall and be broken. But be careful that the stone doesn't fall upon you, right? Is that what Christ says? Matthew chapter 21. But we should be broken in pieces and shattered. We should fall upon the stone, not let God have to crush us in the end because we trusted in the wrong things. Be snared and taken. That's what will happen. That's what will happen if we trust in the system. We need that kind of validation from people. Then they will look toward the earth. Now, that's what I underlined there. These are sensual things. This is earthly. See only what? Distress, darkness, fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into what? A spiritual darkness. And that's the problem. You become consumed. As your eye beholds the darkness, as you look at these things, you look at these people, you look at these power structures, you look at how things are set up, you believe they're fiery threats, all the innuendo, all the nuances, all the cloaking of power, they're just greased down, and all the self-authority. And if you're bowing and scraping and appeasing and obeying the nods and the cues and the innuendos and the subtexts that are there and stuff like that, God's recording all of this. He sees, he's not fooled. He says, you're not looking towards me in heaven. You're not looking towards me as your sanctuary. You're looking towards the earth, is what the text says. And what are you only going to see? Distress, darkness, fearful gloom, and you will be cast into that utter darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. By beholding, you become changed. By beholding, you become swallowed up into that fear and darkness where you cannot turn your eyes towards the sanctuary in heaven. It has become a stumbling block to you because you can't see Christ. He's up in the heavenly sanctuary. And it's like, Christ, I'll get back to you later. I have some bowing and scraping and some conformity to do here. I have some cowardice. I have to take some cowardice business to take care of first. Then I'll get back to you. And you're still going to bless me though, right? And you're going to see as we go through the study, says, no, you may have a kind of a little bit of a lingering time, but in a probation, but I'll start pulling my blessings away. And the whole situation that you have is going to start crumbling in on yourself. You're going to have a false confidence on blessing you. What's going to happen is that Satan is going to take the place of Christ, and Satan himself is going to start blessing you. He's going to start blowing his wind and his air and his sweet nothings into your ear. You're going to think it's God answering your prayers. They will be demons. Be careful. Revelation 21:8, this is the great dreaded verse, but the cowardly, the fearful, Delios, that's that, remember, one of the sons of Aries was Delios. That's why I brought it up. Dread, anti-faith, and then the other correlating sins that come with it, and that's what's going to be here. So when it says the cowardly, in the Greek, Delios, fearful, the timid, these other things aren't a part of a list. These are all in correlation with obeying this God. You are unbelieving. Remember, he says those who have no faith. He already called them abominable. That you become what? Like a murderer of Christ. You become a spiritual whoremonger. Whatever serves your interest at the time. You are as the sin of witchcraft. You become a sorcerer. You play with the little dynamics that are there in the situation. You are an idolater. This is all coming from the same idea. You are bearing a false testimony, and you will lie to yourself and others. And you will have your part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. You will become as darkness. You'll be thrust into utter darkness, Isaiah says. And there is this tendency to fear this, to tremble, which is worship. What makes you go, oh, what deconstructs you? What gets you to conform yourself to something? So are you conforming or are you transforming? Are you going back to you're building yourself up and then you're obeying your cowardice? Or, hold on, let me turn on some lights here, guys. It's getting kind of dark. Hopefully that's a little better. That's a lot better. Because the life of a Christian is to move on into a transformation, ever into the likeness of Christ. Well, I'm talking about David. David represented Christ facing down his enemies, which is death and the grave and our judgment and everything else. So we know that that's all representing Christ, and all these things were written about Christ, but we participate in our own sanctified life in these things. So when I'm talking about David dealing with Goliath, I'm talking about in your sanctification. I'm talking about in your personal worship. If Christ would have submitted to his Goliath out into the wilderness, which was, what Goliath was pictured as, Christ would have been submitting and worshiping and obeying another God other than his Father in heaven. So the reality is that you and I are constantly being tested by these gods, these false gods. And a lot of times these gods present themselves in ways that are pretty well camouflaged and hidden. And whether or not we're obeying our fear, our anxiety, the things that we're worried about our well-being, or if we are appearing as conforming to the people around us because they, have our future or our blessing or, our whatever, our prosperity or whatever it is, these were all the motives for these idols and gods. So when Revelation 21:8 is talking about the cowardly, delios, deity, this idea of those who submit to a deity, they're unbelieving, they're abominable, they're murderers, they're whoremongers, they're sorcerers, they're idolaters, they're liars, and they have no part with God's people. But they will have their part in the lake of fire. They will be consumed. They'll be brought to utter darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, and the realization that they worship the wrong God. Right? And the problem is that there was a heavy climate of this in the New Testament, and it was written for our admonition. And to understand that these people were, these Pharisees, these Jews, these spiritual leaders had monopolized power in such a way that I want you to see how Christ saw them. And I want you to see how the people saw them and how it just wasn't matching. The people saw these people as godly people to be feared. Christ saw them as people that were literally the enemies of him and the Father. That's the time we're in now, whether you like it or not. That is the time we're in. And we cannot afford to be these big spiritual cowards and try to reinterpret the narrative when you know what I'm saying is true. John chapter 7, verse 13, howbeit no man spoke openly of Christ for what? Fear of the Jews. They're even ashamed of him. John 19:38 says, and after this, even Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. This is the climate that was there. And besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave, and he came and therefore and took the body of Jesus. John chapter 20, verse 19, and then the same day at evening, being the first of the week, when the doors were shut, where what? The disciples were assembled for what? Fear of the Jews. Came Jesus and stood in the midst and said, peace unto you. Some people fellowship. They assembled for fear of the Jews. Some people will literally find confederacies and friends and fellowship that do nothing but sit there and validate this whole fear-mongering. Christ has to break into the middle of that. Teach you not to fear. John 8:44, you are of your father, and he's talking to who? The very leadership of Jerusalem, in whom they were the guardians of the center of worship, the devil, The lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer. Remember that list? Delios. From the beginning, abode not truth. Remember, they're liars. There's no truth in him. He speaks a lie. He speaks on his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. It's satanic. Satan is your new god. He's your fear. He's your dread. This is not okay. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, right? This is John the Baptist. He said unto them, O generation of vipers. Remember, it's that generation that Moses was talking about, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come. Why aren't we fleeing from this climate? Luke 3:7. They said to the multitude, came forth to be baptized of him, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come. So all through these gospels is pointing at, escape the damnation of hell. Vipers, generation of vipers, your father the devil. Wrath to come, condemnation of hell. Dread, interesting. Here's the definition. It's interesting in English. Anticipate with great apprehension, fear. Quote, can't swim and what? Dreads the water, or telling him the truth. It's interesting because we're going to touch on this as a very fascinating insight here. Archaic word, to regard with awe. This is what this dread is. An emotion variously combined dread, veneration, wonder that inspired by authority or by the sacred or sublime. The power to inspire to worship. The word dread and worship are synonymous, boys and girls. And what's interesting is that when John was quoting that quote of like, the cowardly will inherit the lake of fire. And then he gives this whole list of what the cowardly look like. The whoremongering, the fearful, they're liars, they're murderers, all this kind of a thing. It's interesting that actually John in Revelation, those were his words before he gets into when he was quoting actually Ezekiel chapter 40, I think 7, where he's going to the New Jerusalem. So if you were to read Ezekiel like 40, 45, 46, 40, you start reading all what preceded the New Jerusalem in the Old Testament, because that's the context that John is looking at. He's reading, he's got the scrolls of Ezekiel out, and he's looking at the context of the New Jerusalem. If you read Ezekiel prior to the description of the New Jerusalem, look at the climate he's talking about. And if you even look at the new heaven, new earth kind of motif in Isaiah chapter 66 and 65, you're going to see in like 63, 64, the motif of fear, motif of transferring your worship, your veneration, your dread, not to the living God, but into the one that somehow has captivated and awe-inspired you into attaching yourself to what is of this world because it's for your self-interest. It's expeditious to do that. And how dangerous it is when God is sending warnings, such as even this video, saying, this is not the time to do it. This is not the climate to do it. This is truly the prior to the coming of Christ. This is a trap. This is something of a snare for you spiritually, to get you to attach yourself to a false God. And this big buildup and saying, I'm going to do better the next time. I just need something more convenient, something that's not going to really put at risk my, my ambition, my desire to be, validated or to be given the sense of significance, or, I don't want my affirmation, because I'm so sick at heart with the need of being validated, that you're this god of cowardice, of Ares, the goat god, the acting all tough until you're wounded and then you run away. And who are your offspring? Who are your siblings? Who are those that you take with you to battle? Phobias, fears, terror, horror. then you justify it by harmony and love. And, I just did it. So, then they jump over to these more kind of appeasement kind of ideas of, well, love and harmony. And if you didn't catch that part, go back and watch this video where I'm dealing with the god of Aries, the goat god, or the ram god. So, Exodus 15:16, fear and dread shall fall upon them, those that what? Are forsaken of God. By the greatness of thine arm, they shall be as still as a stone, till thy people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over which you have purchased. Fear and dread is a part of this worship of God. The idea to pass over is where you get the word Hebrew from. Evri in Hebrew is where really the word Hebrew really comes from. And it's the idea to pass over or to pass through or to pass on the other side through the obscure waters of the Red Sea or of the Jordan or through the turbulence of all of that stuff. That facing your fears is essential for you to be a child of the purchased possession, to you to be an inheritor. That God draws up those fears, and then you attach yourself to fearing God, but pressing on in obedience. And then he takes that fearful thing and teaches you not to bow down to it, and that he is the ruler, the God of those things. And you've learned to switch or to transfer your worship to the living God, but not to build up your dread and your fear and your obedience to that which is self-preserving. To march into the Red Sea, to march into the Jordan, to march into Goliath, to march into these things, in which God says, fear not. It's so important that we get a hold of these things, that it's a transfer of worship. You start to worship the God who faces these things down for you. But if you keep obeying this self-preservation, this kind of convenience, you are reaffirming and revalidating and re-highlighting and re-endorsing this whole other God, this new God, this false God. And you're binding yourself more and more and more. Each time you do, it's another layer of glue. Each time you do, it's another layer of glue. Each time you do, it's another layer of glue, until you are so attached, it's become a Leviathan. Levi, to bond, to attach, a ton, monster. You're bound to the beast. You're bound to the monster. He has given you a sense of fear and dread and debt and submission, and you're binding yourself for a sense of security. Oh, Satan, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me, devil. Please don't. He says, well, if you do A, B, and C, okay, thank you. Well, you got to be friends with the devil, or he's going to hurt you. Satan knows how to play with our fears, and he knows how to play on our anxieties. He knows how to play on your phobias, and he causes us the avenue to worship this false god. You can't appease that and then go and try to be your whoremonger. You're a spiritual whore. You can't go up to God and say, we're still friends, right? It's like, well, you got to go wash your mouth, and you got his cologne all over you, and you got a hickey on your neck. Sweetie, we've got problems. We've got big problems. I know you want me to just pretend that you're not with him, but I'm a jealous God. This is outrageous. This is outrageous that we keep bowing the knee to this. Deuteronomy 32:17. They sacrificed to demons and not to gods. Reemphasis. To gods they did not know, to new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear and tremble and bow down to. 2 Kings 17:35-38. To whom the Lord has made a covenant and charged them, saying, you shall not fear, tremble, dread other gods, nor bow down to them, nor serve them, nor what? Sacrifice. What are you sacrificing? To them. All built on fear, bowing, submission, conforming, appeasing. And the covenant, if you're a covenant person that I have made with you, don't forget it. Don't forget. Rehearse it in your mind. And don't fear and bow down to those gods if you're in covenant with God. The mark isn't just a thing. The mark of the beast, is a constant show of sign of allegiance and fear and not wanting you to receive the wrath of Satan. And if you're doing that now, you will blatantly do it then. There is no, oh, I'll just do it for now. And in Deuteronomy 28, I really want to get into this because it's very powerful. This is one of the blessings and the curses. And here's among these nations, if you constantly do this, amongst these nations, shall you find no ease if you keep doing this. The sole of your foot will have no rest. You will not have peace. You will not have rest with God. You cannot truly Sabbath with God, but the Lord shall give you what? A trembling heart, failing of eyes, and the sorrow of mind. If you keep bowing down to these gods, and your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you shall fear day and night and shall have no assurance of your life. It destroys your confidence with God. It destroys your faith. It destroys your peace with God. You can't play these double games. And in the morning you shall say, would God that it were evening time. And then at evening time, you're going to say, I wish it was morning. You will have no peace day or night. And the fear of your heart that you shall fear, for the sight of your eyes, which you shall see, you will see that you will not be atoned for. Satan will constantly bring up your compromise. He will constantly showcase this before you. He will show you that you did not live in trust of the living God. He will show you that he was your God, that him you obeyed, that he made you fear, that he made you tremble, that he made you submit and you submitted, and that he's your true Lord. And trust me, you will have no peace if constantly all you did was submit and appease and use some form of, Satan, please don't hurt me. Let me appease you. And then I'm going to go sneak over to God and I'm going to have like a little secret allegiance with him. God says you will not have the peace you think you're going to have. It will destroy you. Deuteronomy 28 is telling you of the curses that will befall you until you're destroyed. You will lose your salvation. Is this a small thing? Who's warning you of this? Yet, this is the big climate that we have in Christianity now. This is a comment that I made. Revelation 21 precedes Ezekiel 48. This is what I was talking about before. It references a new heaven and new earth. Ezekiel 47, we're going to touch on that at some point, is talking about the healing waters and the non-flowing bogs. The waters, the troubling water. Okay, this is just a note from me. Stubborn refusal to outlet, murmur to poison, no faith, can't hear Moses. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to have to use this as a comment kind of guide. Prior to the sanctuary, the healing waters, God allows trials to happen to our life. The waters come. And they start at our feet, where we're kind of, where our position is, where we're standing on something. We're establishing ourselves. And so the waters of trial come. Now, if we trust in the Lord, it's healing waters. And then he allows the trials to go up to what? Your knees, you know? Your sense of security. And then he allows it to go to your loins and your waist, to the place where it's the core kind of place where your strength is, where your, you know, the loins of your mind, you know, this type of a thing. It's your core being. It's where your real potence is, your core potence, your strengths. And he allows the waters to come up to your loins, right? To the soft parts. That's the word loins in Hebrew, means soft parts. To the place that's most vulnerable but has the most power in your life. Now, what's interesting is that You can murmur, you can complain, you can have false narrative in your head as the waters start to rise, as the troubles rise. And it destroys your ability for the next level, the next level, the next level, and it becomes like a deluge or like a flood, and it destroys the wicked. Because what is wrong with the wicked in the deluge? Their hearts were evil continually. Their narrative was evil continually. They defied God continually. They exploited one another continually. They feasted on each other as cannibals continually. They could not hear the voice of God. And in fact, when God was sending Moses in, and you can read this in Exodus chapter 3, where he says that the troubles became so major in the murmuring mind of the Israelites when Moses was coming in saying, let God's people go. It's time for them to be out of Leviathan, out of the bounds of this false god, out of Pharaoh representing Satan. In this picture, you're going to have to let them go. The word Pharaoh means house. They're transferring houses. They're coming out of your house, going to go to my house. I want my people. Let her go. Let my bride go. Let my first begotten son go. Let my family go. They're mine. And the people said they couldn't hear the message that Moses had because Pharaoh kept upping the threats, the terror, oh, you want to play that way, do you? Well, we're going to really ruin your lives. We're going to really make life hard for you. We're going to really create problems, perplexities, challenges, hardships for you. They said because of that, they couldn't hear Moses anymore. And that's what Satan does. So he just keeps upping the assaults and the attacks and the troubles and the challenges. And then we start to shut down. What's interesting is when you want to get into the Ezekiel 47 picture in which the waters rise and then they have to swim, that word to swim, in other words, you have to become flat. And the idea of swimming is also the idea to praise, because it's the idea of when they're trying to swim, it's making all this splashing noise. And it's the idea of going flat and praising loudly. That's the kind of the Hebrew visual there. It's the root word to worship. And so the problem is that the Israelites couldn't worship because of disbelief. They believed that Pharaoh was a mighty God. Pharaoh saw himself as a God who would not recognize the eternal living God. And so they took that cue from Pharaoh that he had ultimate authority, and they started to despise the messenger, Moses. They started to hate Moses. They thought he was bringing the problems to them. They thought John the Baptist was bringing problems to them. They thought that Jeremiah was bringing the problems. They thought that Elijah was the troubler of Israel. And you will be labeled that. David, you're causing Goliath to get mad at us. Ezekiel, you're creating problems here. Jesus, you have to be destroyed because you're going to ruin this nation, because you're going to bring the wrath of Rome upon us. There was this huge climate of worshiping the giant god of fear, or whatever the god of this world is fueled by fear, and the messengers got to go. The message has got to go. Don't point out our sins that we have transferred to another god. Don't try to deliver us from this, because we will crush you. Will they crush the message? Yes. Will they crush the messenger? Yes. Will they resent God for this? Yes. Will they pass the trial? Will they worship? Few do. This is a poison. This is a narcotic. And everyone's looking around to see who's conforming to this. And they get their confidence, their assurance that there's all of this conformity, all these people joining hands, all these people linking arms, all these confederacies, all these coalitions, all these people in some kind of weird social contract together. And they're looking around saying, well, they still seem to be blessed by God. They still seem to be like blessed by God. They still seem to be in a good relationship with God. They still seem to have a good spiritual life. These are good people. So-and-so's a nice person. So it can't be wrong to do it. And God is speaking to your heart. He's brought you to your situation, to your crucible, to your crossing of the Jordan, to your crossing of the Red Sea, to your visit from. Why? Because it's your gods that he is trying to break down. It's your idols he's trying to destroy. This is the time when he's getting you to face these things. It is not the time to start bowing down and re-worshiping your Goliath. Right? It's interesting. You know what the word Goliath means in Hebrew? It means circumcised of all things. There's an irony for you. There is a false circumcision and there's the real circumcision. And David was using a word play on galal, to circle. And it's the idea that Goliath had circled them, had surrounded them, had claimed dominion, just like the children of Israel circled Jericho, just like a bride in a Jewish wedding circles the husband, right? It's this whole idea of circling. It's an idea of dominion. And Satan gets you to what? Be in covenant with him. So what was the problem? Self-interest. All this stuff that I'm describing, absolutely describing cluster B personality disorders. The very spirit of this age is narcissism. The spirit of this age is avoidant personality disorder. The spirit of this age is bipolar. The spirit of this age is antisocial personality disorder. The spirit of this age is borderline. And we're all participating in this whole collective psychoses. And we're all validating each other like we're in some strange mania over this. And it's a bunch of crazy people looking to each other, validating each other, saying, oh, we're the ones who have it all together. And yet we're all acting like a bunch of cluster B personality disorders. And we're completely thinking that they're the crazy ones. The people that are the messengers, the people trying to talk us out of our fear and anxiety. We've all agreed to destroy the messenger. We've all just agreed to destroy the message. So there's a strange kind of air. Kimberly says entitlement. That's a great language to it. There's this whole avoidance. There's this whole mania. There's this massive ego trip that's going on here. And it's absolutely the sense of like false confidence. Let me look at this word delios a couple more times in the Greek. We'll get on to some more things. So we're going to move through this study some more. But Christ is dealing with the fact that the worship, the delios, this cowardice, this fearfulness, and not having faith are totally synonymous. You can't do both. You cannot worship the God of this fear and say you're worshiping God at the same time. This is a split worship that you're not doing well. I mean, not even well. You're failing. It's anti-faith is the point. It's not working. You're lying to yourself. Watch this. It's fascinating. Delios. Matthew 8:26, Christ says, and I'll put it in greater context, says, why are you, delios, fearful, cowardly, filled with dread, O you of little faith? Then he arose, rebuked the winds and the sea, because these are our circumstances, and there was great calm. God uses this to conjure up these, it's an apparent thing. I mean, to be honest with you, just to touch on before we really get into the context, is he's trying to show us these are the gods you fear. And God brings these circumstances up not to defeat us, but for us to be broken free and to change our allegiance to him, who is the living God. God didn't bring Moses along to ruin their lives. God brought Moses because they needed to transfer gods. They needed to come back to the God of their fathers. And that's what's happening now. And yet we're obeying all this cowardice, and yet, well, it's about harmony, it's about love, and we don't want to disturb the decorum of everything. It's cowardice, and it's not faith. God is magnifying and pinpointing our false gods that we've been secretly worshiping in the high places of our mind. We may have broken down all the obvious altars, but the high places still there. Greater context of this, Matthew 8:26. So verse 20 says, and Jesus said unto them, the foxes have their holes. In other words, yeah, welcome to loneliness. Welcome to not having a place. The birds of the air have their nests. The Son of Man has what? Nowhere to lay his head. This is a circumstance that he's talking about, this no faith, worshiping the false god. And another of his disciples said unto him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. It's all of this excuse making. It's all these things of convenience. But Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury the dead. Now, don't pass by this too quickly. There's always a reason to go and do what's expeditious. There's always this fear that I'm going to be left without a home. I'm going to be left hanging. He says, listen, the birds have their nests. The foxes have their holes. I don't have that place. But Lord, you should accommodate me because I shouldn't have to go through all that stuff. Let me do what's expedient, and then I'll come back at a more convenient time. He says, no, this is the context. Get on the boat. Get on the boat. This is not about your convenience. This is not about your comfort. This is not about you having a place to lay your head. This is about weaning you from that. This is about pruning you from those things. And when he says it's time to get into the boat and to face the storm, it's time to do this, even though it might seem like God is asleep. God isn't there. God has left me out to die. Well, he leads us to this. He even said to the children of Israel, I'm going to let you guys hunger in the wilderness. I'm going to let you guys thirst, and I will feed you, and I'll give you drink. But you have to realize that you've attached yourself to a false god with Pharaoh. Your flesh pots, your fish, your leeks, your melons, your onions, all of these things. That was your murmuring, was your form of worship. Your internal narrative that is just playing the tapes inside of your soul is your dialogue of worship. Even though you complain about it, you're worshiping. Even though you're getting yourself built up to fight against Goliath, it's still your worship. You are still conceding. You're still acquiescing. You're still bowing. You're still scraping. Yeah, you sit there and you complain about these people, and then when you face them, you crumble. You'll sit there and talk with your friends, and yeah. And then every time you're with them, you're kissing up to them. You're appeasing them. You're flattering them. You're kissing their ring. Brother Klingstone. Amen. Glad you're here. Man, I so wish, Brother Nathan, you would have caught the rest of it, some heavy stuff we were covering, man. Please go back and watch it. It's idol killing. It's idol killing time. But it's not like it's going to be any slouchy stuff we're going to go through now. And when he had entered into the ship, his disciples followed him. And God will put you into a situation that you cannot escape from. That ship, they're not going to escape from. And behold, there arose a great tempest of the sea, right? And the ship was covered with waves, but he was asleep. Now, what's fascinating about this is, what's powerful about this is that the God that is Baal was considered the god of the storm, the god of the tempest, the god that gave great harvest and stuff like that. There was a fear of Baal, the fierce god, the fierce Lord, the one who is mighty to take and to give and all this other kind of stuff. And demons were kind of really creating this whole worship of Baal, the idea of a husband, how a woman is to fear and to give deference to her husband, and she's to wait for him to provide and appeal to him in this way. And there's this kind of womanly quality that one has towards Baal. There's this appeasement and all this is, they're cutting on themselves, the prophets of Baal. There's this emoting and emotionalism, just pouring yourselves into Baal. And God is like a husband, he's a Lord. And what's here is saying, okay, let the storm rise up and let's see if you're still attached to Baal. If you have a secret Baal going on here, worship. Because I'm your Baal, I'm the provider. I am the God of the seas and the waves, and I could calm those things. And it seems that God was asleep on the job. Remember that Elijah was mocking the priests of Baal, saying, is your God asleep? And his disciples came to him and woke him. This is a God you could just go to him, right? Saying, Lord, save us, we perish. And he said to them, why are ye delios, cowardly? You have no faith. Remember, these are synonymous. Then he arose, rebuked the winds and the sea, the circumstances, because these were what? Artificially produced to cause you to fear Satan and what he could bring in the circumstances. And there was a great calm. You see, that's the fruit of overcoming and awakening Jesus to our battle. The men marveled, right? True worship, awe, saying, what manner of man is this, that even the waves and the sea obey him? A true Baal, a true God. You want a fresh new experience with God? Let him put you in the boat. Let him put you into a situation you cannot deliver yourself from. Let him bring up all the fears, all the attachments, all the false loyalty and all the false sentimental connections that you have with all of, where Satan, he just dominates you and he prevails over you, and the narrative of fear or the lack of I'm going to have an empty hole, I'm not going to be validated. And then we just yield to what he says, and then we're conquered every time. Christ stirs up all of this, and then we're able to give a transfer to the Lord of the Lords, to the God of the gods, to the King of the kings. Molech means king. Baal means Lord. He's the Baal of the Baals. He is the Molech of the Molechs in that way. He is the one that causes them to serve him. And the way they serve him is that they stir these things up. You are shown for the worshiper that you really are, and then you have the opportunity to transfer gods to the living God and to defy and to stare down these false gods. Not to go from the living God to a new God, to a false God, to an allegiance to things of the flesh and demons. Mark chapter 4, verse 40, and then we're going to get into it. It says, why are you so fearful, cowardly, dread? Why is it that you have no faith? You see how that's the context? But check this out. I want you to see the context in which, real quick. Now you're going to have the same story, but the context. Remember, birds have their nest, foxes have their holes. Let me go bury my dead. I don't get those conveniences. So what parallels the preceding story of being in the boat and the whole idea of who's their God and faith and fear? Let's go into what Mark does. In other words, really, it's Peter through Mark. He's going to tell you what precedes it. And these are parallel. When you study the scripture, the foxes have their holes. The birds have their nests. And the guy says, hey, listen, can I bury? And he says, nope. It's not about your convenience. That is parallel with what I'm going to read you in Mark chapter 4. Check this out. Interesting parallel. So, and he began again to teach by the seaside. Remember, this is all a seaside kind of situation here. This is, and then they get onto the boat. And there was gathered unto him a great multitude, so that he, what? Entered into a ship. And he sat in the sea, and the whole multitude was by the sea and the land. And he taught them many things by parables, and said unto them his doctrine. Now, what is his doctrine? This is what Peter starts bringing out through Mark. Came to pass as he sowed. It's the parable of the sower. And some fell by the wayside. In other words, some people weren't picking up on this stuff, and the fowls of the air came and devoured it up. In other words, demonic beings made sure that it was of no consequence to you when Christ is trying to help you to have faith and trust in him. Some fell on stony ground where it had not much earth, and it was immediately sprang up. There's a quick growth. Oh, yeah, I get it. It's this whole, oh, I got it real fast. Intellectually, I got it. But it had no depth, right? It wasn't settled in the soul. But when the sun was up, it was scorched. When the trial came, when the testing came, when the severity of trial came, it was scorched because it had no root, and it withered away. The withering away is the idea of cowardice, right? Some fell amongst thorns, tough situations, real life challenges. The thorns grew up and it choked it and yielded no fruit. You became so focused on the thorns and the trials and the challenges that it killed out that good seed. But others fell on good ground and it yielded up fruit, sprang up, it increased. And this is what Kimberly had asked from the very beginning. How did you transfer and how do you minimize Satan? How do you magnify God? And it says it sprang up, increased, brought forth some 30, some 60, some 100, invest, trust. And he said unto them, he that has an ear, let him hear. Remember that quote in the book of Revelation to the 7 churches? This is the context that John is thinking of it in. It's around managing your fear and your worship and your gods. And Christ was saying in the midst of his children, saying, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to my people, that this is about trusting me, having faith, and do not transfer your gods. Trust in me, I'm the living God. And he said unto them, unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. And I'm breaking down the mystery of the kingdom of God to you right now. But unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables. In other words, this just sounds like a story, but these parables should be telling you the deep insights into truth. That seeing you may see and not perceive, and hearing that they may hear and not understand. You see, these things I'm talking about, some people are going to shut their hearts, their ears, their eyes, their spirit too. They don't want to know that the reality is that God is going to test you, put you into a circumstance, and that is your greatest opportunity to switch gods. And if you go with what's familiar, you go with your familiar spirit, you go to the familiar gods, you say at a more convenient time, you are losing each opportunity. And the more you do that, of parting from a false god and transferring your allegiance to the living God. Lest at any time they should be what? Converted. And their sins should what? Be forgiven, or you remain in what? Bondage of your sins. Verse 15. And these are they by the wayside, where if the word is sown, but what? They heard, but Satan immediately comes and takes that word, by how? The murmuring, the narrative, the dismissiveness at a more convenient time, and have no what? Root in themselves. So they endure but for a time, but afterwards, when affliction or persecution arises for the word's sake, immediately they are what? Offended. Oh, well, this doesn't count. And the cares of this world, there's another one. Well, it's not convenient. You got to care about this world. You got to care about your situation. You got to care about, your opportunities. You got to care about your status, your well-being, your career, what will stabilize you in this world. And the deceitfulness of what? Your riches, your advancement, your promotion, and the lusts of what? Other things entering in. Whatever, all other things, etc. You name it. You come up with a list. They choke the word and it becomes unfruitful. You cannot obey those narratives in your head. You have to dismiss it. You have to take the opportunity to break from Leviathan and to bind yourself to God, lay a hold of his robes, and don't let go no matter how fierce the warfare is. Now, let me ask you real quick. Let's say you don't do this. Let's say you hear this and you go, David, blah, blah. David, I just don't like the way you said it. I don't like your shirt. I don't like your style. I'm sorry. I need to hear it in a sweeter way that appeases, my woundedness all the time. But God knows my heart. He knows I secretly want to do those things. One day, if he makes it convenient enough, I may do it. Do you think we can mock God? Do you think we could fool him? We could deceive him that he doesn't know the real kind of plain interplay and narrative and linguistics of our soul, our heart, that he doesn't hear the murmuring? He doesn't know our heart and the narrative of it and the continual narrative and the way that we bat things down, that we listen to Satan. When persecution comes, there's a certain kind of self-soothing narrative. There's a type, of personality disorder that's perfect for you. So you can fit into your cluster B core personality disorder, and you can be a part of the children of the corn, the children of Satan, the wicked, viperous generation of this time that's always having some kind of a narrative that fits into its self-soothing conformity of this world of self-interest. Do you not think that Satan knows exactly how to create that narrative in our hearts, in our head? Because trial comes, or the deceitfulness of riches, or the other lusts, or the fact we don't want to endure persecution, because our sense of significance, our sense of validation, we worship this sense of being affirmed and petted and spoken to smoothly. We want the oil poured into our ears. Hey, Ellen, thanks for even joining us. Let's pray for each other. All right, let's keep moving on.